What would you do if you came back from a trip to find a hotel being built in your land? Without your permission? That's exactly what happened to one black man when the HOA decided to take matters into their own hands. But what they didn't know was that this man wasn't someone to be pushed around. Instead of backing down, he set a legal trap that would make them regret ever thinking they could steal from him. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? Anthony had always taken pride in his farm. It wasn't just a piece of land to him, it was his home, his livelihood, and his escape from the hustle and bustle of the world. For years, he worked the land with his own two hands, slowly building up a life he could be proud of. The crops he grew, the animals he raised, and the peace he found there. Everything had been carefully nurtured, but his peace was about to be shattered in a way he never saw coming. The HOA had been eyeing his property for months. They saw it as prime real estate, just sitting there on the outskirts of town, untouched. It was the perfect spot for a hotel, a development project that would bring in more money for them and change the whole area. And what better time to act than when Anthony was away on a business trip? They figured he'd never even know what happened. But they made one huge mistake. Anthony had left the farm with a sense of security. His land was his pride, and he didn't think anyone would dare touch it while he was gone. But when he returned home, he found construction trucks, bulldozers, and piles of building materials scattered across his land. The HOA had started building a hotel on his property, and they had no idea they had just walked right into his carefully laid legal trap. Anthony's heart sank when he first saw the construction trucks on his land. What had once been his peaceful escape was now a chaotic scene of bulldozers and workers tearing up the earth he had carefully nurtured. The HOA had gone too far. He had trusted his land. He had trusted his absence would not be taken advantage of. But they had used his absence to turn his farm into their latest project, a hotel of all things. He walked up to one of the workers, his anger bubbling under the surface, but he kept his voice steady. "What's going on here? This is my property," Anthony said, trying to stay calm. The worker barely looked up, simply nodding to the construction site behind him. "The HOA approved the plans. You should have received notice." Anthony's blood ran cold. He hadn't received anything. Not a single letter, no phone call, no warning. His mind raced. Why would they build on his land without his consent? They must have known he wasn't around. They thought they could get away with it. But what they didn't know was that Anthony wasn't someone to just roll over. His land wasn't just a piece of property, it was everything to him. He had built his life around it. The farm was where his father had worked, where his ancestors had walked. It was the place that connected him to his past, and now it was under threat. Anthony knew he couldn't let them bulldoze his heritage away. He spent the next few hours walking around the construction site, his anger turning into focus. What could he do? The HOA was powerful, and they had the money to push through anything they wanted. But what they didn't realize was that they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that because he was away, they could go unchecked. They didn't know that Anthony had learned the ins and outs of property law years ago, preparing himself for moments like this. As he stood there looking at the workers, something sparked in his mind. He knew exactly what he had to do. He wasn't going to let them take his land without a fight, but he wasn't going to take the fight to the streets. No, this was a legal battle, and he was going to win it with the power of the law. The next day, Anthony made a phone call to a lawyer he had known for years, a calm, experienced woman named Jennifer, who had helped him with smaller legal matters in the past. When he explained what had happened, there was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "You're telling me that the HOA started construction on your land without your permission, and they didn't even bother to contact you?" Jennifer asked, her tone a mix of disbelief and concern. "Exactly," Anthony replied, feeling the anger rise again. "They think because I was away, they could just do whatever they want. But they're wrong. I'm not going to let them bulldoze my farm, my history, without consequences." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "This isn't just about stopping construction," she said thoughtfully. "This is about a bigger legal trap. We have to make sure that they can't just ignore your rights. If we play this right, they'll be forced to stop the project and deal with the consequences." Jennifer explained that there were legal loopholes they could use, things the HOA had overlooked. They didn't realize they had violated the property rights of a landowner, and Anthony could use that to his advantage. But it would take careful planning. The HOA thought they could steamroll him, but they didn't know that Anthony was preparing to hit them where it hurt the most, through the legal system. Over the next few weeks, Anthony and Jennifer worked tirelessly, collecting every bit of evidence they could find. They researched zoning laws, property rights, and every piece of documentation related to the land. They found that the HOA had failed to secure certain permits that would have been necessary for such a large project. They had also bypassed the required public consultation for the area. But Anthony didn't stop there. He knew that in order to really put a stop to this, they needed to expose how the HOA had taken advantage of him. And they had done it in a way that broke the law. The legal trap was set. Jennifer filed the paperwork, and the moment it was submitted, the wheels began to turn. Anthony's once quiet farm was now at the center of a legal storm, and the HOA had no idea what was coming. They had thought they could simply build and get away with it. They had thought Anthony wouldn't fight back. But now the legal notice had been served, and their project was on hold. The HOA, once confident and arrogant, began to sweat. The moment they realized what had happened, they scrambled to find a way out. Anthony's legal maneuver had trapped them. They had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions, and Anthony was ready to watch it all unfold. The legal battle wasn't over, but the moment Anthony got the first response from the court confirming that construction had to stop, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The land was his, and no one, no matter how powerful, could just take it without a fight. As the court date neared, Anthony felt the pressure building. The HOA would have their chance to defend themselves, but he knew they had no real case. They had broken the law by failing to properly consult him and by going ahead with a project they didn't have permission for. Anthony had done his homework. He had carefully researched every part of the legal system that could work in his favor, and now he was ready to use it. The day before the hearing, the HOA sent an attorney to try and make a deal with Anthony. They offered a settlement, promising to compensate him for the land and give him some money in exchange for dropping the lawsuit. But Anthony wasn't interested in their money. It wasn't about that. It was about something far more important: respect for his property and his right to say no. He refused their offer, and the battle was now set for the courtroom. The day of the hearing arrived, and as Anthony walked into the courthouse, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was fighting for his right to be treated fairly, for every person who had ever been wronged by people in power. As the judge took the bench, Anthony's lawyer presented their case, outlining how the HOA had acted illegally by failing to get the proper approvals and by disregarding Anthony's rights. They had overstepped, and now they would have to pay the price. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue, but it was clear from the start that the court saw through their excuses. The evidence was too strong. The law was on Anthony's side. And when the judge finally ruled in Anthony's favor, ordering the construction to be halted and the HOA to compensate him, it was a victory not just for him, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of a bigger system. The HOA had walked right into his trap, and they had underestimated the power of one man standing up for his rights. The day of the hearing had finally arrived, and Anthony felt the weight of everything he had fought for pressing down on his shoulders. The courtroom was buzzing with the usual noise, but to him it was like the world had paused. This wasn't just about his farm anymore. This was about justice, about standing up for what was his. He knew the HOA, once so confident, now had to face the consequences of their careless actions. Jennifer, his lawyer, had prepped him for this moment. She had explained that the legal battle wouldn't be easy, but Anthony knew that they had all the cards on their side now. The HOA had messed up. They had assumed Anthony's absence meant he was vulnerable. They hadn't accounted for him coming back and having the legal knowledge and determination to fight back. As the hearing began, Anthony sat in the back, listening intently as Jennifer presented their case. The room fell silent when she detailed the HOA's failure to follow proper procedures, the lack of permits, and the blatant disrespect for Anthony's land. The judge, a stern but fair man, listened carefully. It was clear that the evidence was stacked against the HOA. The opposing lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man representing the HOA, stood up to make his case. "Your Honor," he began with a confident tone, "we're not denying that construction was started on this property. However, this land was always part of the larger development plan. The HOA had the legal right to move forward with this project based on zoning regulations and approval from local authorities. Any issues with the landowner's absence are irrelevant to the legal process. The judge didn't seem convinced. He glanced at Anthony, who sat with his hands folded but a fire in his eyes. This wasn't just about legal technicalities anymore. It was about what was right, and Anthony had made sure the court understood that. Jennifer stood to counter the HOA lawyer's argument. Your Honor, while the HOA may claim to have been working within the framework of local zoning laws, they ignored one very crucial detail: the fact that the land belongs to Mr. Anthony, and they had no consent to alter or build on it. The HOA proceeded without notifying him, and the construction, based on their actions, is a violation of Mr. Anthony's property rights. Moreover, we found evidence that the HOA did not follow the proper procedures in public consultation, which is mandatory for projects of this scale. The HOA lawyer shifted in his seat. He tried to interrupt, but the judge raised his hand, signaling that the court was listening to Jennifer's argument. Furthermore, Jennifer continued, the HOA has failed to provide valid permits for this construction. They assumed they could steamroll a landowner who wasn't around to defend his rights. They ignored the law, and now they must be held accountable. Anthony couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as he listened to Jennifer. She had done her part, but it was his land that had been disrespected. It was his heritage that had been disrespected by a group of people who thought they could buy and bulldoze their way through anything. But now they had met someone who would fight back. The judge turned his gaze from Jennifer to the HOA lawyer, then back to Anthony. This is a serious matter, the judge said, his voice steady. The legal rights of property owners must be respected. You've presented compelling evidence, and I'll need some time to consider the full impact of the HOA's actions. The tension in the room was thick. The HOA lawyer seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. He had walked into this hearing with confidence, assuming that the case would be over quickly, but now he was beginning to see that this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Anthony had done his homework, and he had made sure that the HOA would be forced to answer for their actions. As the judge recessed for a brief period to review the evidence, Anthony sat still, not letting himself get too hopeful. He knew this was just the beginning. The legal system could be unpredictable, and even if the judge ruled in his favor, it wouldn't undo the damage the HOA had done. But one thing was certain. He had fought back. He had stood his ground, and he had exposed the truth. When the judge returned to the bench, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him as he prepared to deliver his ruling. After reviewing the evidence and hearing both sides, the judge began, I've come to a decision. The HOA acted inappropriately by beginning construction without notifying Mr. Anthony. They did not obtain the necessary permits, and they bypassed the required consultation process. This court finds that the HOA violated Mr. Anthony's property rights and has engaged in actions that are both unlawful and unjustified. A wave of relief washed over Anthony, but he didn't allow himself to get too excited just yet. The judge continued. As a result, the court orders that construction on this land be halted immediately. The HOA will be required to pay restitution to Mr. Anthony for the damages caused by their unauthorized actions. Additionally, they will be subject to a full investigation into their practices regarding zoning laws and public consultation. I expect this to be a lesson in accountability. Anthony's heart raced. This was it. The judge had ruled in his favor. Not only was the construction on his land going to be halted, but the HOA would be held responsible for the violations they had committed. It was a victory, a hard-fought one, but it was his. The room erupted into murmurs. The HOA lawyer stood up, clearly stunned. Anthony didn't care about their shock or anger. He had won. The HOA had underestimated him, and now they would have to pay the price for their greed and carelessness. As the courtroom emptied, Anthony walked out slowly, taking in the full weight of the victory. He didn't need to gloat. This was about justice. This was about ensuring that no one would ever think they could take what was his without paying the price. As he walked back to his farm, Anthony felt a sense of pride in knowing that he had stood up for himself and his land. The HOA had thought they could simply come in and build a hotel, assuming he wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight back. But now they knew better. The law had worked in his favor, and the system had finally acknowledged his rights. For Anthony, this wasn't just about the farm. It was about showing the world that no one, no matter how big or powerful, could take what was his without facing the consequences. He had won not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been wronged by the system. The victory in court was only the beginning. Anthony had always been a man who moved cautiously, carefully laying his plans. He knew the HOA would not take this loss lightly, and he wasn't naive enough to believe they would simply walk away. As he stood at the courthouse steps after the ruling, he felt a sense of accomplishment, but it was a quiet, controlled kind of victory. There was still much to be done. Jennifer had already warned him that this fight wasn't over. The HOA won't just fold, she had said. They'll come after you, try to intimidate you, or find ways to delay things. Be ready. Anthony's phone rang the next morning. It was Jennifer again, but this time her tone was different. The usual calmness was laced with something else, something that made Anthony's heart race. Anthony, I need you to come into the office. We found something. The way she said it made Anthony's pulse quicken. He had a bad feeling about this. He had just won his case. Things should be peaceful, but Jennifer's voice told him otherwise. When he arrived at her office, she had a stack of papers in front of her. She pointed to a specific document, one he hadn't seen before. It looks like the HOA has something they didn't disclose during the case, Jennifer said, her voice sharp. This is a huge issue. Anthony leaned in, scanning the papers. What he saw made his stomach drop. The HOA hadn't just failed to notify him about the hotel project. They had also been involved in a shady land deal that included his property. The documents outlined a secret agreement between the HOA and a private developer, showing that they had planned to buy up several neighboring farms, including his, for redevelopment purposes. Anthony's hands shook as he read the fine print. The HOA had been involved in backroom deals to acquire the land without informing him. Not only had they assumed they could take his property for a hotel project, but they had been plotting to push him and others out entirely. This was more than just a mistake, Jennifer said, her eyes narrowing. They were working behind your back, planning to cut you out of the picture entirely. Anthony's mind raced. The HOA had made their move, believing he was just another landowner they could push aside. But they had underestimated him, and now they had exposed their hand. They weren't just looking for a hotel. They were aiming to reshape the entire area, buying up properties without the owner's knowledge. The realization hit him like a brick wall. The battle wasn't over. It had just gotten bigger. The HOA wasn't just a group of local bureaucrats making a power play over a piece of land. They were part of something much more sinister. What can we do? Anthony asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his head. Jennifer looked at him, her expression grim. We can expose them. We can go after this in a way that they'll never recover from. Jennifer wasn't just talking about getting compensation or forcing them to halt construction. She was talking about exposing the entire corruption behind the HOA's actions. And as Anthony thought about it, he realized this wasn't just about the land or the hotel anymore. It was about standing up to a system that thought it could walk all over people like him. The legal trap Anthony had set had worked, but now he had an even bigger opportunity to make them pay, not just for their attempt to take his land, but for everything they had done in the shadows. The next few days were a blur of legal documents, meetings, and strategy sessions. Jennifer had helped Anthony gather all the information needed to expose the HOA's shady land deals. It wasn't easy. There were legal hurdles to jump, documents to trace, and meetings to arrange. But Anthony didn't flinch. He was ready for this fight. The twist in the story wasn't just that he'd caught them in the act. It was that he was going to take the fight to a level the HOA never expected. But just as they were preparing to go public with the information, another bombshell dropped. The developer the HOA had been working with wasn't just any company. They were a powerful, well-connected firm with ties to several high-profile politicians in the area. This developer had been quietly purchasing up land for years, and the HOA had been their partner in the scheme. The more Jennifer dug into the connections between the HOA, the developer, and the local politicians, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one man's farm. This was about a system of corruption that had been in place for years, designed to push out small landowners and replace their properties with expensive developments that serve the interests of the rich and powerful. Anthony could hardly believe what he was reading. He had always known that powerful people didn't play fair, but to see it all laid out in front of him was staggering. The HOA, the developer, and the politicians were all working together, using their combined influence to push people out of their homes. And now Anthony was right in the middle of their plan. "This is bigger than we thought," Jennifer said, her voice low. "If we go public with this, it could shake the whole city." Anthony knew she was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about his land. This was about exposing a system that had been rigged to benefit the few at the expense of the many. And Anthony wasn't about to back down. They decided to take the next step, an all-out media campaign that would expose everything. They began reaching out to investigative journalists, local news outlets, and anyone who could help shine a light on the corruption behind the HOA's actions. The story would go public, and when it did, the HOA and their partners would be forced to answer for their actions. The day the story broke, Anthony felt a mix of emotions. There was a sense of victory. He had fought back, and now the truth was out there for everyone to see. But there was also a weight to it. He knew that going public meant facing even more opposition, more attempts to silence him. But the truth had come out, and there was no turning back. The backlash was swift. The HOA tried to spin the story, claiming that their actions were in the best interest of the community. They tried to discredit Anthony, claiming that he was just another disgruntled landowner. But the public wasn't buying it. The evidence was too strong, the connections too undeniable. The community rallied behind Anthony, and soon the political pressure was too much for the HOA to ignore. In the end, the hotel project was halted permanently, and the HOA was forced to pay millions in restitution to the landowners they had tried to exploit. The developers' ties to the local politicians were also exposed, and investigations were launched into their dealings. The entire system that had allowed these powerful players to operate unchecked was starting to fall apart. Anthony had done what no one expected. He had used their own system against them, exposing the corruption that had been hidden for so long. It was a victory that went beyond just his land. It was a victory for every small landowner who had ever felt powerless in the face of greed. The storm of legal battles was over, but the aftermath still left a lasting impact. Anthony had emerged victorious, but the fight was far from simple. After months of gathering evidence, facing off with powerful opponents, and exposing a system that had long worked against him, Anthony had finally forced the HOA to pay for their actions. The hotel project was officially stopped, and the HOA was ordered to pay restitution to the landowners they had wronged. But the victory meant something more to Anthony. It was a win for justice, for fairness, and for everyone who had ever been dismissed by those in power. It wasn't just about reclaiming his land. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how big or powerful, could take what belonged to him without facing the consequences. Anthony had stood tall, had fought for what was right, and now the world knew that even a small landowner could take on the establishment and win. The day the news broke, Anthony stood on his land again, looking out over the fields that had been at the center of this fight. The wind moved the tall grass gently, and for a moment, he let himself breathe. It had been a long road, one filled with frustration and doubt, but it was all worth it. He had faced the system head-on and had forced it to recognize him, not as just another farm owner, but as someone who had a voice and the courage to use it. The media was abuzz. Local reporters swarmed the area, eager to talk to Anthony. His story was an inspiring one that resonated with people who had felt powerless in the face of corporate greed or government overreach. He became a symbol, a reminder that power doesn't always come from money or connections. Sometimes it comes from standing your ground when everyone else is trying to push you down. The local community rallied around him, and the support he received reminded him that, despite the difficulties, he wasn't alone in this fight. The HOA, once arrogant and sure of their success, now found themselves in turmoil. They had underestimated Anthony's determination. Their attempt to bulldoze his farm had turned into a public relations disaster. The community turned on them, and their influence began to erode. The legal costs alone were staggering, but the lasting damage to their reputation was far worse. They had tried to silence one man, but in doing so, they had awakened an entire community to the power of standing up for what was right. But Anthony wasn't concerned with their downfall. What mattered was that he had taken back what was his. His land was safe, and the legal victory was one he could look back on with pride. But more than that, it was a lesson that echoed in the hearts of everyone who had been following the case. Don't let anyone take what's yours without a fight. Jennifer, his lawyer, was another person who had played a crucial role in this victory. She had seen through the HOA's attempts to cover up their shady dealings and had helped Anthony navigate the complexities of the legal system. Over time, their professional relationship had grown into a deep respect for each other's tenacity and determination. Jennifer had told Anthony, "You didn't just win your farm back, you showed everyone that justice can still be served, no matter how powerful the opponent." It wasn't just about the legal system. It was about the moral victory, the understanding that no one should be able to take advantage of someone just because they feel untouchable. Anthony's case highlighted a truth that many people often forget. It's not enough to just know your rights. You have to be willing to stand up and fight for them. The HOA had assumed that because Anthony was quiet, because he was away, they could just push him aside. But they hadn't realized they were dealing with someone who would never let go of what he believed in. Anthony's story became a beacon for those who had felt ignored or sidelined by the system. He had set a new precedent for how people could fight back, not just through anger, but through patience, knowledge, and the careful use of the law. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it worked. The system, for all its flaws, had still delivered justice in the end. For Anthony, the fight wasn't just about stopping the hotel. It was about proving a point to himself, to show that no matter the odds, no matter the opponent, he could stand tall. He wasn't some helpless figure in the face of bureaucracy. He was a man with a history, with a voice, and with the right to protect what was his. As the months passed, the world moved on, but Anthony's story didn't fade. It remained a reminder that change, while difficult, was always possible. The HOA had tried to erase his farm and replace it with something that would benefit the rich and powerful. But Anthony had stood in their way, not with force, but with a quiet, determined strength that forced the system to acknowledge him. Anthony never got rich from his fight. He didn't need to. The money from the restitution was fair, but it wasn't why he had fought. The real reward was knowing that he had made a difference, that his land, his history, and his future were secured, that no one would ever again try to take something from him without realizing the cost. As the seasons changed and the crops grew again, Anthony would often walk the land, his eyes scanning the fields. It was his home, and it would remain his home, not because of any legal document or court ruling, but because he had fought to keep it that way. He had fought with everything he had, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt that the system wasn't made for them. The moral of Anthony's story was simple, but powerful. Never let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. Never let anyone think they can take what's yours without facing the consequences. Anthony had proven that one man, standing firm with the law on his side, could change the course of an entire battle. And that in itself was the greatest victory of all. Anthony's fight wasn't just a battle over land. It was a fight for respect, for fairness, and for every person who had been overlooked by a system designed to benefit the powerful. He had shown that the power of one person's voice, armed with knowledge and the law, could stand up against the greed and arrogance of those who think they can take whatever they want. Today, Anthony's farm remains exactly where it belongs, untouched by the hotel that the HOA had hoped to build. The community rallied around him, and his victory sent a message that resonated far beyond his property. It was proof that even when the odds are stacked against you, there is always a way to win. It's about standing up, getting the facts, and using what's rightfully yours to create change. But the fight isn't over. Anthony's story isn't just a tale of legal battles. It's a reminder that people like him, people like you, can make a difference. If you've ever felt pushed aside or ignored by the system, just know that you don't have to take it. Stand up for what's right, use your voice, and make sure that those who try to take from you know that there are consequences. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to fight back for what was rightfully yours? How did you handle it? Let us know in the comments below. If you believe in standing up for what's yours, share this story, like, and subscribe for more stories of real-life justice. The power of one voice can change everything.